So this talk is Einstein never wrote a definitive account of his theory. And so this is the information source I'm going by. It's a paper by BURNISTON Brown. It was published in 1967 in a science journal, and it criticises Einstein's relativity. There's a paper written in 1967, and that seemed to be a time when it's a bit more free in being able to publish papers criticising Einstein's relativity in science journals. Things are a bit more blocked nowadays. This is the paper, and it starts off: genuine physicists, that is to say physicists who make observations and experiments as well as theories, have always felt uneasy about relativity, and that's Einstein's relativity. As Bridgman said, if anything physical comes out of mathematics, it must have been put in another form. The problem was, he said, to find out where the physics got into the theory. This uneasiness was increased when it was clear that distinguished scientists like Darwin and Levin could be completely misled. So he's talking about these two people being misled into believing it. And Darwin wrote a fatherly letter to Nature describing the simple way in which he explained relativity to his friends. The simplicity, however, was due to the fact that, with the exception of a quoted formula, there was no relativistic theory in it at all. So Brown is criticising Darwin, and this is not the famous Darwin from evolution theory. It's Darwin who's dealing with Einstein's relativity, and according to Brown, no, he's not dealing with whatever Darwin thinks is Einstein's relativity is not Einstein's relativity. And that's one of the big problems with arguing over Einstein's relativity, that people who claim to believe in Einstein's relativity don't. They believe something else, but they're calling it Einstein's relativity. So carrying on, and Levin likewise gave a supposedly relativistic proof of the results of an optical experiment by Sagnac, but as his countryman Metz said, although as ceci elegant, it was not relativity. So that's another example. Somebody believes in Einstein's relativity, but the criticisms come back is no, they are believing something else and calling it Einstein's relativity, and that creates a massive amount of confusion when you're trying to argue that there's a problem with Einstein's relativity if the people you are believing in Einstein's relativity have not understood Einstein's relativity properly and are believing something else. And so overall he's complaining people have been misled into believing it, which is Einstein's relativity. It's an issue that Einstein's relativity doesn't make sense. Some recognise it doesn't make sense, while others believe in it regardless whether it makes sense or not. And this is what Bernstein Brown carries on to say. There is other disturbing features: the fact that Einstein never wrote a definitive account of his theory, and that was the one pointed out by the title of this talk, that Einstein didn't give a definitive account of his theory. That his first derivation, that is Einstein, of the Lorentz transformation equations contain velocities of light of c minus v, c and c plus v, and square root of c squared minus v squared n square root psi, quite contrary to a second postulate that the velocity of light was independent of the motion of the source. And I've dealt with that issue of speeds in another video I've done about the mysteries of speed addition in Einstein's relativity. But Brown is here noticing the problem in 1967, and the response of the believers in Einstein's relativity seems to be to just ignore the problem. And the response of believers in Einstein's relativity seems to be to ignore any problem pointed out to them and carry on regardless. And I'll put a little picture here of the film Carry On Regardless. So you're making a big mess of things, but you don't mind, and you're just carrying on anyway. And that's what the believers in Einstein's relativity seem to be doing. Make a mess, carry on regardless. So picking up on what Brown says, Einstein never wrote a definitive account of his theory, and that seems to be the core of the problem with Einstein's relativity. It's just something vague that gets subjected to lots of different interpretations by the mainstream, and that was the problem that has been pointed out with the two believers in Einstein's relativity, Darwin and Levin, that they were claiming to believe Einstein's relativity, but it was their version of Einstein's relativity, and they were not really believing in what Einstein's relativity was. So Einstein's relativity could be said to be neither fish nor fowl. So it's neither one thing or another. It's some sort of vague theory which people can place different interpretations into it and then claim to believe it. So there's a lot of time being made trying to make sense of Einstein's relativity. You've got a theory that is not properly defined, and you're trying to work out what it's supposed to be meaning. So Brown goes on to say, the special theory of relativity is therefore founded on two postulates. A law about laws, which is the principle of relativity, and then next thing is an algebraic representation of what is or could be a fact, the velocity of light being constant, or you could talk about is being the speed of light being constant, and that's subject to lots of different interpretations, but light speed is usually taken to mean light in a vacuum. And then there's a third thing upon which relativity is based, which is Brown pointing out, and that's a cuckoo process. So a cuckoo process means a process that does not make sense. So you're starting from two postulates, and what you're doing with those two postulates does not make sense. So Brown is pointing this out in 1967, that this is what Einstein's relativity is based upon. You're doing things which do not make sense. Brown goes on to say, Einstein's attempt to derive the Lorentz transformation equations from the principle of relativity and the postulate that the velocity of light, is often you could think of as speed of light as well, is independent of that of the source would, and this is brackets, if it had not involved contradiction, close brackets, have made Lorentz transformations independent of any particular assumption about the construction of matter. And this is brackets again, as it had not been in Lorentz's derivation, close bracket. So when Lorentz was dealing with it, Lorentz was dealing with it in a different way to what Einstein was dealing with it. This feature, of course, was pleasing to the mathematically minded, and Pauli considered it as an advance, and so Pauli is another physicist. Einstein said that the Lorentz transformations were the real basis of the special relativity theory, and that's what Einstein was saying in 1935. And this makes it clear that he had converted a theory which in Lorentz's hands at any rate was a physical theory. So from Lorentz, the Lorentz transformations were being treated as a physical theory. And this is brackets involving, for instance, contraction of matter when moving with respect to the ether, close brackets. That's what Lorentz was dealing with. Lorentz was dealing with ether theory, and supposedly most people think that Einstein's relativity of special relativity is not an ether theory, but that's arguable, into something that is not physical theory in the ordinary sense. So Einstein seems to be converting what is a physical theory from Lorentz into something which is not a physical theory. But the physical interpretation of a set of algebraic transformations derived from a principle which turns out to be a rule about laws, together with a postulate which is or could be just the algebraic expression of a fact, the independence of the velocity of light of that of the source. Brackets, experiments already done appear to confirm it, but more direct evidence is needed, close brackets. So he's complaining that Einstein took a physical theory and turned it just into a mathematical theory which is not really connected to actual physics. And then Brown goes on to say, we see then that the relativity is not an ordinary physical theory, it is what Sign called a cuckoo process. That is to say, nature's laws must be found first, and then they can perhaps be adapted to comply with the overall principle. So he's going into more details of what he considers is the cuckoo process. It's what Einstein did with the Lorentz transformations taken from Lorentz theory, where Lorentz theory is a physical theory, and then Einstein applies the cuckoo process to that, which is something which doesn't make sense. And this is that's a quote from Sigg, who says, the eggs are laid, this is referring to cuckoos, not on the bare ground to be hatched in the clear light of Greek logic, but in the nest of another bird, where they are warned by the body of a foster mother, which in the case of relativity is Newton's physics of the 19th century. So what cuckoos are supposed to do, I'm not really up on this biology thing, the cuckoos are supposed to lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and that these eggs are then brought up by other birds, and the mother bird doesn't realise she's been lumbered with a cuckoo egg. So it's a cuckoo process that's making a mess of things. And in the case of Einstein, he's taking Newton's physics and Lorentz's transformations and turning something into something else by what is called a cuckoo process, or making confusing a mess of things which doesn't make any sense. And now, according to Brown, the cuckoo process is why Einstein's relativity does not make sense to many people. He says the basis of the theory explains a great deal that has mystified many physicists and engineers, and the cuckoo process is what's mystifying people. They could not understand how Einstein could sometimes speak as though the ether was superfluous, and that's Einstein 1905, and at other times say space without ether is unthinkable, and that's Einstein 1922. So he's referring to the confusing things that Einstein has said about ether. This was due, of course, to not starting with physical terms, matter, its motion, and its interactions, which is brackets force, close brackets. A Physical theory, which included radiation, would have to start by stating whether an ether action at distance or ballistic transmission force was being postulated. It explains also how mass and inertial force get into the special theory, which is founded on geometrization of uniform velocities. For it's well known that inertial forces do not appear when the velocities are uniform. Formulae which purport to give the relation between measurements in one state of uniform velocity and those made in another state of uniform motion cannot logically throw any light on what happens during the change from one state to the other. This is only possible by using the cuckoo process. Assuming Newton's theory's second law and the conservation of momentum, and then modifying it. So that's the mess Einstein's making, the cuckoo process, onto Newton. It also makes clear how Einstein could call Tolman's account of theory, this is Tolman 1934, definitive, and also praise Bergman's treatment, which is 1942, where the former author thought length contraction real and the principle observable, whereas the latter seems to have thought it only appearance. So Brown's criticising that the cuckoo process leads to Tolman thinking one thing about Einstein's relativity and Bergman thinking something else about something else about Einstein's relativity, and then Einstein, so being such a cuckoo, is saying they're both the same thing. And so, no, they're not. They can't. They're contradicting. Tolman and Bergman are contradicting themselves, but Einstein doesn't seem to see that there's a contradiction, maybe because he's so confused, and then it's all just cuckoo. It doesn't make any sense. I could go on to point out the rest of what Brown says, but the point is made. A great many things said by those who believe in Einstein's relativity does not make sense, and if point out to them, then they just ignore it. Papers were originally published criticising Einstein's relativity, but the supporters tended to ignore such papers, and once everything had been said on the issue pointing out what was wrong with relativity, there was no point in just repeating those old issues ad nauseum, and the papers that were criticising were blocked. So that's what seems to happen. The debate upon what Einstein's relativity is seems to be blocked. The people who thought there was a problem with it pointed out what they thought were the problems. The response by the people who believe in it is just to ignore that, and then, well, the debate is not taken up and it's just all blocked in the journals. And so Einstein's relativity became a theory beloved and defended by the mainstream by ignoring its faults. And that is the end of this little talk, explaining to you part more of the mess which has been made with Einstein's relativity. Thank you. The end.